So we are at the last section. We want to understand how muscle contraction, um, how it happens and how much an energy it requires. So we went over the mechanism of muscle contraction. Now we are learning how much or how it gets its energy in order to do the task. Okay, so for normal muscle function, it requires a substantial intercellular energy reserves is required. So a lot of muscle contraction requires a lot of energy. So energy reserves are a must in order for muscle contraction to take place. Number two, it requires normal circulatory supply, that is, a blood supply is required by muscles. Number three, the level of blood oxygen level is very important. A normal blood oxygen level is required for normal functioning of the muscles. And fourth, a blood pH within normal limits are required. So these are some of the four factors that is absolutely required in order for a muscle to work properly. Number one, energy reserves. Number two, blood supply. Number three, oxygen supply. And number four, a normal blood pH. A single muscle fiber may contain about 15 billion thick filaments. As you know, we learned about thick and the thin filaments. So it contains about 15 billion thick filaments. When that muscle fibers is actively contracting, each thick filament breaks down to produce about 2,500 ATP molecules per second. So I want you to understand how many ATP molecules are broken down by each thick filament. So in order to keep the demands for ATP in the contracted muscle fibers is so high that it would be impossible to have all this amount of energy that is required to store them in the form of ATP. So instead, a resting muscle fiber contains enough ATP and other high energy compound to sustain contraction. Until it waits until new ATP molecules are made. So it stores a little for its continuous work, but it then relies on the new generation of ATP to be made. Throughout the rest of the contraction, the muscle fiber will continuously make ATP in the process and different activities that we go on. So the first is ATP and creatine phosphate reserves, which is very important. And as you can understand that this is stored energy, and as a result, how it does it, we will learn that. The primary function of ATP is to transfer energy from one location to another rather than to store it long term, okay, because it's unable to store that huge amount of ATP required. What it does is ATP transfers energy to creatine. Okay, what is creatine? Creatine is a small molecule that is present in the muscle cells, and that actually helps to store the energy. Okay, the energy transfer creates large amount of high energy compound, creatine phosphate, and also that the creatine phosphate is also known as phosphocreatine. So basically, creatine phosphate releases stored energy to convert ADP to ATP. So what is happening in here, ATP plus creatine is forming ADP and creatine phosphate. Again, ATP plus creatine is forming ADP and creatine phosphate. And this ATP and creatine phosphate can then be converted into ATP and creatine, and that ATP can be used for initial energy source that the muscle requires. So that's the basic storage of energy in the muscles and how they are available to be used as frequently as needed. Okay, but the main energy source of ATP takes place in a little bit different manner. Okay, let me go. So here you can see the different ways of muscle metabolism, how it is occurring. Number one is the direct phosphorylation that we just learned with the help of creatine and creatine phosphate. And then there are two processes that take place. One is known as the anaerobic mechanism or glycolysis. The other is known as aerobic mechanism or aerobic cellular respiration. So what is it? All muscle contraction depends upon ATP, as we have learned. No other source of energy can serve the purpose. The supply of ATP actually depends upon two mechanisms, as I just said. One is the anaerobic mechanism, which does not require oxygen. The other is aerobic mechanism, which does require oxygen. So there are pluses and negatives of both the mechanism. And in our body, we do use both the mechanism as and when required. Okay. So let's understand each of these have advantages and disadvantages, as I just said. Anaerobic fermentation or anaerobic mechanism enables cells to produce ATP without the need of oxygen. As I said, oxygen is not required. But the ATP yield in this case, as you can see, is very less. It's 2 molecules of ATP is produced. And in the process, when glucose is used, it goes through glycolysis, it forms pyruvic acid and then forms lactic acid. Now, this lactic acid is released in the blood and it causes changes in the pH of the blood, okay? So, this production of lactic acid causes muscle fatigue, okay? And for example, if you have not exercised for a long time, you will see if you suddenly go to do exercise, you will see muscle cramping, muscle pain, and those are all because of the deposition of lactic acid. Okay, so although this happens in the absence of oxygen, it does not require oxygen, but you have to remember it produces smaller amounts of energy molecule, and it produces lactic acid, which causes muscle fatigue. The other part is the anaerobic aerobic respiration, which involves oxygen. Yes, we do require oxygen in the process. It produces far more number of ATP, as you can see here, 36 molecules of ATP. It does not produce lactic acid, but it requires a continuous supply of oxygen, okay? So this process, which is aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen, is the main source of energy for muscles for all of our activities, okay? So we require this aerobic mechanism to start once the anaerobic mechanism has stopped. So the muscle can go on doing anaerobic mechanism to a certain extent, and then the aerobic mechanism has to kick in or start in order for the muscle activity to continue doing it. And you can see the starting material in case of aerobic respiration, which is also known as a Krebs cycle or TCA cycle, tricarboxylic acid cycle, is the same. So it's pyruvic acid, and then pyruvic acid goes into the Krebs cycle to produce tons and tons of ATP. So during the course of exercise, when we are doing exercise, so how does the, this is basically showing you how the initial phosphagen system works in our system. This actually shows you during exercise how the energy sources change from one to the other, okay? We will learn the immediate energy, then we learn short-term energy, and then we learn the long-term energy. intense exercise, such as a 100-meter dash, the myoglobin in the muscle fiber supplies oxygen for a limited amount of aerobic respiration at the onset. So at the beginning, it is myoglobin, we have certain store of energy it produces, but this oxygen supply is quickly depleted. As we go ahead and do the exercise, we are breathing heavy, the oxygen supply gets depleted, um, unless and until the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system catch up. Okay, and is able to keep the oxygen demand. The muscle meets most of the ATP needs by borrowing phosphate groups from other molecules and transferring it to ATP. But remember, this is short term. There are two enzymes required in the process, which is myokinase and creatine kinase, and these are all enzymes that can give you the initial ATP requirement through the phosphagen system, through the creatine phosphate system. Okay, this is the immediate energy. The starting point of the energy that you need is within the muscle. That's the first part. Then moving into the short-term energy, as the phosphagen system, that the creatine phosphate system is exhausted, the muscle now are transitioning into anaerobic metabolism to buy time. It wants to buy time so that the cardiovascular and the respiratory system start functioning, and oxygen is available to take over the next step of the process. Okay, so it has to be aerobic respiration and metabolism to take place. So this short-term energy, once the initial phosphagen system has exhausted, the muscle then goes into anaerobic metabolism. As such, and it is using the available oxygen present. During this period, the muscle obtain glucose from the blood and their own store of glycogen, and they produce 2 molecules of ATP, which is really less. And you can see the initial part, so you can see how from this phosphagen system, it has actually gone into anaerobic system, where the available oxygen is used and the available glucose is used to produce molecules of ATP to continue with the exercise. Now, once that is done, once the available oxygen is no longer there, then it goes to, after about 40 seconds, the respiratory and the cardiovascular system is now ready, is now functioning heavy, and can deliver oxygen to the muscles fast enough for aerobic respiration to meet the demands of the body. Now the aerobic, which requires oxygen, is in place. As a result, it produces more ATP molecule. It produces 30 to 32 molecules of ATP per glucose molecule, and this is effective to keep the next phase of exercise to go on. I want you to understand that this is a continuous process, true, but there are certain, and you can see these are all examples how these phosphagen system works initially for the sprinters. For swimmers, glycogen lactic acid system, which is the glycolysis process, helps. And for marathon runners, absolutely, you need aerobic respiration to work effectively. I want you to understand that these lactic acids that are built in the process of glycolysis process can be detrimental at times, when it can cause muscle fatigue. The exhaustion of energy can also cause muscle fatigue. The muscle fatigue. So the question is, what is muscle fatigue? Muscle fatigue is it's a process. It's a progressive weakness or and loss of contractibility that results in prolonged use of muscles. So whenever there is the contraction process goes on and on without less amount of relaxation, it leads to muscle fatigue. And it can be many reasons, and as is shown, it can be buildup of lactic acid, it can be exhaustion of energy resources, it can be the electrolyte balance is gone. So there can be many reasons in which muscle fatigue can take place. And so when the muscle contractibility actually reaches 70% or maximum, we just learned that the muscle always requires blood vessels. I started this section by saying that. The reason why we require blood vessels to be available for the muscles is we require the cardiovascular and the respiratory system to work hand in hand in order to keep the oxygen delivery. If the oxygen delivery system is impaired, it will lead to muscle fatigue again. And the last part of this lecture is this muscle fibers can be of 3 different kinds: fast fibers, slow fibers, and intermediate fibers. Fast fibers, they contract fast, and that's the reason they are known as fast fibers. These are large in diameter, densely packed with myofibrils. They have large amount of glycogen reserve, which can be converted into glucose for its activity. And usually these are white muscle fibers. So, and if you have seen a chicken, you will see there are certain parts which are white and certain parts which are pinkish. So the white part those are the fast fibers. They contract fast. They are packed with myofibrils. They are usually, the diameters are thicker, and they have large stores of glycogen in them. The slow fibers, on the other hand, they contract slow, but they can remain in the contracted state for an extended period of time. The diameter is just half of that of the fast fibers. They have more mitochondria, of course. They need more mitochondria because they are working through an extended period of time. They have a red pigment, which is known as myoglobin, and we will learn about that later on when we learn about hemoglobin, myoglobin, etc. So the red pigment, myoglobin, is present, which gives it a pinkish color, and it is known as red fibers. The slow fibers, they contract at a much extended time. They have ample mitochondria to give them energy, and they are usually red in color. And intermediate fibers is in between these 2 fibers, which is rare. Okay, so overall, this actually gives you an idea of the anatomy of the muscle, the microscopic anatomy of the muscle, how the muscles are made, how muscle fibers are made, and then it gives you an understanding of the mechanism of muscle contraction and relaxation. As I said before, the relaxation process is equally important as the contraction process, and the contraction process actually happens in several stages. This leads to the different kinds of process that take place in our body, or we do in our day-to-day lives, which is exercise, etc. How the energy demand is met by the muscles in order to do those activities. And then there are different kinds of muscle fibers that do the task. Thank you.